All right, so this morning we are in Genesis 13, and sometimes God speaks in some ways after I'm done preparing. And I finished up kind of the final touches on our lesson this morning, kind of last night about 9:30 or something like that. And I looked at an email, and it was from somebody that was asking me for a CV, for a curriculum vitae. And I was just going, oh man, I don't even have one. And it was somebody that I'm speaking to. Imagine this: I'm speaking to a group of optometrists in January. Okay, any optometrists in the house, or ophthalmologists, or anybody like that? Yeah, I can't even spell optometrist. So I'm speaking to a group of optometrists and doing a continuing education for them in January. So they needed a CV. And I literally have not even looked at that document in about 7 years. And I pulled up what was there and wound up brushing up a few things so I could be able to send it to her. But I kind of got reflective just looking at my CV. And there are CVs that are much more impressive than mine, for sure. But I was looking at it, and I was overwhelmed with gratitude, I think, in some ways, because I've really gotten to do a lot of fun things. It's just been really enjoyable. But I think one of the things that struck me is that all of those things that are on the CV were kind of growth spurts. I mean, there were times that God moved me and a new chapter started. And when this new chapter started, man, there was just a lot of growth. There was a lot of things that I learned. And there was a lot of things that I got wrong and a lot of things that I learned to get right. But the other thing that I realized is that almost all of those moves, all of those new chapters in my life were preceded sometimes by failure, many times by drifting, and a lot of times by restlessness, right? So today, chapter 13 is opening with this fresh failure that he has had coming out of Egypt. And he's moving into a new chapter, not only for himself and for his family, but for really a new nation and for the world in many ways. And the thing that we know is that Abram was told to go to Canaan, and he drifted. And he wound up in Egypt, and we're not sure that if he drifted just because he was in search of food, or if he was just being defiant, or if he just got lost. We don't really know. But either way, he wound up in Egypt. He lied. He nearly lost his wife. He nearly lost his life. And he embarrassed himself in front of Pharaoh. And then God intervenes. And it's always this pivot that in the middle of our restlessness, in the middle of our failure, in the middle of our drifting, God has this tendency to show up. And God preserved him, and he protected his wife. And he brought him back to the place that he called him to. When I looked at my CV last night, one of the things that was very clear was that there's been a calling in my life since I was 19 years old that I've been sure of and still am sure of. I know what that calling is. I've known what that calling is. And it's been interesting to just kind of look at these chapters in my life where some of it was probably drifting away a little bit, and some of it was God fine-tuning that calling. But in any of the kind of changes that I looked at, I saw God just bringing me back to this one thing that he's had for me all along. And I am not smart enough or spiritual enough to have figured it out. I only see that in hindsight, where a man makes his plans, but the Lord orders his steps. That has been the theme of my life, and we see this coming into the scene with Abram. So let me ask you a question this morning, or maybe a couple of questions. What do you do when you drift? What do you do when you feel far from God? I mean, sometimes it's easy when you've drifted, especially, to believe lies. It's easy to kind of begin to take action that's not anchored in the truth of God, but because you've drifted from the truth of God, it's tempting to believe lies, and your priorities and your actions sometimes follow these lies that you wind up believing, and they get reshaped in some ways. Sometimes when we drift, we start grasping for what seems to be normal because we've drifted from the standard, which is truth. And then we grab on to whatever seems right in that moment and seems like it would be profitable, or it seems like it would be effective. And sometimes we don't know what to do, so we look around and we see what everybody else is doing and we do that. Kind of a monkey see, monkey do, kind of a mimic kind of thing. Sometimes when we drift, we just kind of jump on that first track that seems to be effective and may even get frantic. When I was in high school and college, I was a lifeguard, and one of the things they told you, if you actually go out into the water to rescue somebody, maybe one of the best things to do is to just punch them in the face as soon as you get to them. And reason being is they're frantic. They're going to grab a hold of you to get air. And if you can kind of get them in a place where they're a little bit stunned, you've got their attention, you can kind of pull them in a little bit, right? Sometimes we need that when we've drifted. Well, what about when you fail? What do you do then? How do you respond to failure? Do you get defensive? I mean, do you start rationalizing, minimizing, and making excuses when you failed? Do you get aggressive? You start blaming other people? You know, it's always somebody else's fault. It's always convenient to have somebody to blame, right? Is that what you do? Or do you get determined? You just kind of double down and say, no, I'm gonna just try harder. And sometimes we try harder at doing the same things that didn't work the first time, right? But sometimes we just want to double down, and sometimes that's a pride thing. Or do you get distracted when you fail? Do you just start other things? So it takes the heat away from the place that was failure, and there's no real correction, and there's no real accountability with that. So today I want us to take a look at what Abram did. And from what we know, at a minimum, he drifted, and kind of after drifting, we see that he failed. So Genesis 13 shows us a man who, in the middle of drifting and failure, what does he do? He returns to worship. He recenters his life on God. He chooses faith over grasping and over being frantic or over being defensive, which he could have been any and all of those things. And the Bible Project says it this way. In this chapter, Abram is learning to trust the promise even when the circumstances push him toward self-protection. And when we've drifted and our pride has been hurt, and we fail and our pride has been hurt, there is a natural tendency for us to get self-protective. So what follows here is this story about wealth and conflict and humility and failure and blessing. And we're going to see what God does with him in the middle of this. And what it shows us is that we don't have to fight for position. God does this on our behalf at times. So let's look at verse 1, and let's just jump into the text. So Abram went up from Egypt to the Negev with his wife and everything that he had, and Lot went with him. And I highlight this in my notes here, that Abram had become very wealthy. Okay, Abram had become very wealthy in livestock and in silver and in gold. And from the Negev, he went to a place he went from place to place until he came to Bethel, to the place between Bethel and Ai, where his tent had been earlier, and where he had built his first altar, where he had first built an altar. And there, Abram called on the name of the Lord. All right. So we see Abram recentering his life. He leaves Egypt. He leaves the Negev, the valley that was fertile, that was plush, and he went back to where he came from. Now, a couple of things. Abram leaves Egypt with increased wealth. Okay, and this was despite his failure. And this is the second time we see this. Genesis tells us a couple of times that Abram was wealthy. And this is something that's just pure grace. He didn't earn it. He didn't necessarily deserve it, but God blessed him with this wealth. In Dr. Constable's notes, I use him as a resource. He said this. He said that this prosperity is something that's neither commendation nor is it condemnation. Okay, wealth was kind of a neutral thing. Now I want us to think just for a second about wealth, because it's not really inherently virtuous and it's not inherently corrupt. It's a tool in somebody's hands. And that's all it is, okay? And some of you know great wealth, some of you know poverty, some of you've known both. But I want us to think a little bit about it. Wealthy people And I don't know much about wealth other than what I read. But wealthy people are smart, but they may not be smarter than anybody else. Wealthy people they work hard, but may not have worked any harder than anybody else. They offer a quality of work that maybe has a lot of attention to detail, but not necessarily any more so than anybody else. But there are some things that are unique to people who are wealthy, and here are a few of those. They tend to live below their means in most cases. They tend to avoid any unnecessary debt. They keep showing up. Some of you have heard this story about Max Lucado. I'll get into the short version, but Max Lucado is an author that was rejected like 59 times. And he just kept showing up, even though somebody would take his manuscript and toss it in the trash can until eventually he was published. And now we know him as Max Lucado, right? So the wealthy people just keep showing up. They're usually avid learners. They're willing to tolerate a certain amount of risk. They're willing to be patient with a process. And they tend to be connected with many of the right people. And in some cases, their network is also wealthy. And for most wealthy people, there's this unexpected promotion. There's this breakthrough. There's this favor that happens that they'll often say, I don't really understand why it happened. I know I was doing a lot of the right things, but so were a lot of other people. But then there was this breakthrough that just kind of came. But when we look at Scripture, one of the things that Scripture seems to always point to when it indicates that somebody is wealthy is that there is something about the favor and there's something about the goodness of God. And one of the things that we can be certain of is that wealth, no matter what, is something that is rooted in God's purposes, and God will use that wealth and that person who is wealthy as a steward to accomplish His purposes. And this is kind of what we're seeing with Abram. So God's blessing, and we see him getting this blessing, is not revoked by his failure. God was going to accomplish His purposes anyway. Last week we were talking at the table about, I can't remember exactly what the question was, but one of the things that I was talking about is those times that when I've stepped out in faith, I get those holy shoulder taps. Have you ever gotten those? That when you step out in faith, God just kind of taps you on the shoulder and says, "Hey, Pepper, you're going in the right direction. You know, I'm right here with you." And I can't help but wonder that as Abram was leaving Egypt with a lot more than he went to Egypt with, if God didn't use that in some way as a holy shoulder tap for Abram, just to be able to say, "Hey, I want you to know the calling is still sure. My purpose, my promise is still on you." And as just a display of that, I want you to look around you and see everything that I've blessed you with. This is for me, okay? You are not a self-made man here, Abram. Okay, this is something that I've blessed you with and I have given you. All right, so let's look at verse 3. So it says, he returned to the place where he had made this altar and he called upon the name of the Lord. Now, I'm not sure, we don't really know if he just kind of wandered back here and just happened to go, oh, here's this place, I remember this. Or if he scurried back there intentionally. It seems to indicate that Abram kind of retraces his steps. And it says that he goes from place to place, but the place that he lands, the place that he came from, is the place that he worshiped before. Okay, and this is kind of important, and I want us to kind of hang on to this thought in just a minute because I'm challenging you to think about this for yourself. All right, so what happens is that Abram kind of reverses this detour that he had to Egypt by going back to the place of promise and the place of that he experienced God's presence. So what is his first act after he failed? It's not achievement, it's not expansion, it's not self-justification. It's worship. He goes back to a place that he had experienced God before and he worshiped. So let's think about this. For you, when this happens, okay, what do you do? When you've blown it, when you've hit a dry patch, when you feel far from God, what do you do? Well, if we're doing what Abram does by example, return to the last place that you met with God. Return to the last directive that He gave you. Return to the last promise that He gave to you. Return to an anchor and get connected to that. I love Psalm 63, and I'm going to read some of this to you. Actually, I'm going to read the whole Psalm to you. But you may mark this in your Bibles and go back to this. I turn to Psalm 63 often when I'm in this dry patch because David was there. He says, "Oh God, you are my God. Earnestly I seek you. My soul thirsts for you. My flesh faints for you as in a dry and weary land where there is no water." Now this just sounds like David, doesn't it? It sounds like David's man after God's own heart. He's seeking after that. This is actually a lament. This is a complaint. David is saying, I'm in a dry patch here, God. I am in a place where I'm so thirsty and nothing seems to quench it. I'm in a place that everywhere I look for you, I can't find you. And I'm in this dry and weary land where there is no water. I'm in a spiritual desert, is what David is saying. Well, what does he do? Verse 2, "So I've looked upon you in the sanctuary, beholding your power and your glory. I returned to a place where I encountered you," is what David says. He goes on, he says, "Because your steadfast love is better than life, my lips will praise you. So I will bless you as long as I live in your name, and I will lift up my hands. My soul will be satisfied with fat and rich food, and my mouth will praise you with joyful lips." And then he goes on, he says, "I remember you upon my bed, and I meditate on you in the watches of the night. For you have been my help, and in the shadow of your wings I will sing for joy." And then by the end of this psalm, you remember he started off, he was looking for God, and he was in a land that he didn't have any water. He was thirsty. But by the end of this song, he's saying, my soul clings to you. Your right hand upholds me. And those that seek to destroy my life, there's the reason he was in a dry place, is that he was on the run. There were people trying to kill him. That'll do it to you. Okay? But by the end of this, he says, "But the king shall rejoice in God." He remembered his calling. In this moment, he wasn't on a throne. He was probably in a cave. Okay? So he was on the run, but he still remembers his identity. By the time you get to the end of this psalm, he says, "The king shall rejoice in God, and all who swear by him shall exult, for the mouths of liars will be stopped." All right? God comes to fight for him by the end of this. So where is your Bethel? Abram goes to Bethel. He goes to this place where he had worshiped before. Where is the place that you meet with God? Where is your holy ground? I've got a couple of those. And if you notice in the Psalm, David had a public place and he had a private place. Right? His public place was in the sanctuary. His private place was in his bed. Right? So where is yours? I mean, I got to thinking about that. Well, I mean, I've got a lake down in Chester County that I love to go to. I've mentioned this before. Man, I can just go down there. I don't have to fish. I don't have to hunt anything. I can just go sit in the grass. Okay, and for me, for a lot of different reasons, that's a Bethel for me. That's a place that I've met with God before, and I can meet with God on a regular basis. Another place for me is my chair in my living room, because that's where I meet with God almost every morning. And it's an appointment that's on my calendar in my mind. And if I miss that appointment, then there's a problem. My day is different, but it's a sacred place for me. But I could go on. I mean, there are other places that I just remember God showing up in such mighty and powerful ways. The first church where I was a pastor had a pulpit on it. And on the pulpit, and the person preaching is the only one that could see it, there was a sign that was on the pulpit at the bottom of it. It just simply said, "Sir, we would see Jesus." In other words, if you don't talk about anything else, if you don't show us anything else, we want to hear about Jesus. This is what we want. That's a sacred space for me, right? Where's yours? Think about that. Maybe mention that at your table. I didn't tell you your question. I meant to tell you that a little earlier, but that could be a part of the question. But the question this morning is, and I've just completely lost where the question is. Come back here, question. There it is. So where is or has God been asking you to trust Him or His promise instead of grasping for control? So that's your question for today. Where is or has God been asking you to trust Him for His promise instead of grasping for control? But maybe one of the things that you add to that is, where has been your Bethel? Have you had a Bethel? Have you had a place that you go to, that you meet with God, that you're reminded of His presence? Maybe it's a public place, or maybe it's a private place. Or maybe it's just the last thing that you remember God saying to you. Sometimes that last thing that God told you to be obedient to is a good place to return to. All right, verse 5. The story kind of shifts here. So now Lot, who was moving about with Abraham, also had flocks and herds and tents. But the land could not support them while they stayed together, for their possessions were so great that they were not able to stay together. And a quarreling arose between Abram's herders and Lot's and the Canaan. And I love this. We're going to give a little attention to this. The last part of that, verse 7, it kind of reminds you of a verse earlier, but it says, the Canaanites and the Perizzites were also living in the land at that time. Why would the writer include that? Okay, so we're going to come back to that. So one thing to just kind of notice, when there is blessing, it tends to create tension, especially among people. And we talked about this a couple of weeks ago, but is it possible for people to have envy when God blesses you? You better believe that it does, okay? But blessing sometimes creates tension. Sometimes conflict doesn't necessarily come from lack, but it comes from abundance. I had an office in Nashville a few years ago. I went to Nashville once a week after my grandbaby was born. I thought it'd be a good idea to start an office there. We came close to moving there and didn't. But it was kind of interesting in Nashville because it was in Franklin. Because if you're in Franklin, man, if you don't have a therapist or a life coach, you're weird. Okay, I mean, everybody in Franklin and in Nashville has a therapist and a life coach. So I could put up a lemonade stand in Franklin, and I think it'd be prosperous. But my schedule filled up quickly, and that's a different crowd, man. I mean, the Franklin music business kind of crowd is just kind of a different crowd. And I wondered when I went there, would I wound up encountering anybody in the music business, and I did. Many of them were just kind of aspiring artists, in some ways. Had one Grammy Award winning engineer at some point, and that was kind of cool. But I had this guy that came into my office one day, and I didn't recognize him or didn't think anything about it. He kind of had the rock star look about him, but a lot of people do, so I didn't think anything about it. And I said, so tell me what you do for a living. He said, well, I'm a singer-songwriter. I'm like, okay, well, that's good. And he could tell I wasn't very impressed. And he said, no, you don't understand. He said, I was with a pretty big band for a long time, and we played in stadiums all over the world. And I said, really, what band was that? And I'm not going to tell you the name of the band. But he told me the name of the band, and I was like, oh, okay, I do know who you are, as a matter of fact. And I went on and spent a lot of time with him and his wife over the next few months. And he's known like the tops of crazy rock star kind of wealth, right? I mean, he's known all of that. But he proceeded to tell me all the kinds of problems that went with that. And the thing that I learned is that wealthy people, super wealthy people, have the same problems that everybody else does, right? But there's also another set of problems that wealthy people have that most of us would never want, right? And for him, there was almost this paranoia of not being able to trust anybody because he didn't know what it was that they were after. He didn't know what it was that they were wanting. So certainly you can get some friction when there's lack, when there's poverty, but there's also a set of friction and even envy and all kinds of tensions that come along with wealth. And when you look at what's going on, what you have here is you have a problem where there's like 5 gallons of resources in 10 gallons of cattle, okay? And what happens in all of that is, yes, I mean, there's some, probably vying for position that Abram's servants have and Lot's servants have. But y'all, there were probably animals that were dying, okay? Because when there's a lack of resources, it's not necessarily just about who gets more land. It's about we've got all of this life that's not going to continue to be alive and not going to continue to be life if somebody doesn't do something, right? So there's this problem that exists, and it's not just that these two sets of groups were quarreling. There's a problem that has some real practical needs that needed to be announced. And then we come to this part where the writer just tells us, and the Canaanites and the Perizzites were living there. Okay. Now you remember back in chapter 12, we were talking about the oak tree and that there's There's this oak tree where a lot of diviners and diviners, or whatever you call them, and mediums would gather. And it says, in the Canaan, this was the land of the Canaanites, and it was kind of pointing out to us, giving us a little bit of a interjection there to explain it a little bit better. And I think that happens here too, because what we're talking about is we've got all these resources, and they're limited, and there's not even enough resources in the land to sustain Abram and his clan and the wealth that was going along. But you also have natives that are living there. You have Canaanites and Perizzites. They're using the land too. So the asterisk that's there by telling us that is letting us know that the resources were even more scarce, because you have other inhabitants of the land that were needing to be able to use it as well. All right? Okay, so verse 8. So Abram said to Lot, let's not have any quarreling between you and me, or between your herders and mine, for we are close relatives. And that's an understatement I'll come back to in a second. It's not the whole land before you. Let's part company. And if you go to the left, I'll go to the right. And if you go to the right, I'll go to the left. All right, so he's saying, look, let's don't have strife here. Let's remember that we are brothers. It's not just that we are kinsmen, but he's saying to him, look, man, we are, literally it says we are man brothers. Okay, that's what the Hebrew says. We are man brothers. This is a needless dispute. King James Version says, instead of says, let's not have any quarreling, it says, I pray thee. Okay, I mean, for goodness sake, we are brothers. This is an unnecessary dispute. Let me ask you a question. Why do people get frustrated? There's usually one good reason. Exactly. We get frustrated or we get angry because we don't get what we want. Okay? And it's not that what we want is bad. Sometimes it is. Sometimes what we want is our ego to be honored. Okay? But many times what we want is good, okay? What Abram was wanting was for his livestock to be able to eat. What Lot was wanting was his livestock to be able to eat. And those were good things. And they had a problem because they also wanted something else. They also wanted to be together. And sometimes you get to a place where you realize there are two good things that I want, and those two can't continue together, right? And sometimes when you're not getting what you want, here's what you do. You either change what you're doing to get what you want, or you change what you want. One of those two things, right? And they were faced with this decision. They both wanted two good things, but they couldn't continue to do that together, so they had to change what they wanted. They had to change their mind. And the solution to this, and Abram proposes this, is, if you want to go to the left, I'll go to the right. If you want to go to the right, I'll go to the left. So Abram yields in this moment. And sometimes that's just hard. But in humility and really in an act of faith, Abram had every right to keep his hands on it and to control that. Because the promise and the calling was to Abram and not Lot. Lot was somebody that was going along for the ride. And it's not that maybe Lot hadn't worked hard. He probably had. It wasn't that Lot hadn't been loyal. He probably had. But Abram was the guy, not Lot. And Abram has this opportunity to assert his authority and to impose his will, but he chooses not to. He backs away from that. And in this particular case, he chooses to believe the promise that God has given him, even when he's faced with losing a lot of his wealth to his nephew, right? So it's kind of the opposite of Babel. I mean, Babel was, let us make a name for ourselves, and Abram is let God choose. Let God choose for you, for me, for my name, for my place, and for my family. Let God be the one that chooses. All right, verse 10. So Lot looked around, and another phrase for that says that he lifted his eyes, and he saw that the whole plain of the Jordan towards Zoar was well watered like the garden of the Lord, and like the land of Egypt. And another one here is the zinger, okay? And we'll come back to this one too. It's in parentheses in the ESV. But it says, this was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. Okay, just throws that in there. So Lot chose for himself this whole plain of the Jordan and set out toward the east, and the two men parted company. And Abram lived in the land of Canaan, while Lot lived among the cities of the plain. And then I've kind of underlined this too, and he pitched his tents towards Sodom. And now the people of Sodom were wicked and sinning greatly against the Lord. So the scary music starts in these verses here, okay? It's just giving us just a little bit of an overture. We're going to get to the rest of it later, all right? So both Abram and Lot had seen the Nile River, okay? And remember, we talked about the Nile River, and it's a great river. It's a river that just provides nourishment for the plain and the valley that it's in. And the Jordan River, when they looked toward the Jordan River and they looked toward Zor, it was well watered. It wasn't the Nile River, but it provided a lot of nourishment, right? So this was kind of the southern point where the Jordan River dumps into the Dead Sea, and it was in this valley, and it has this flat expanse of fertile, really opulent land. Okay, and the scripture here says that it was like the garden of the Lord, right? Has anybody ever been to the Garden of the Gods over in or not in East Tennessee, but in Colorado Springs? You been to that? That was so disappointing. Man, it's a bunch of rocks. You know, I didn't see any tomato plants. I didn't see any green beans. I didn't see any of the stuff that I was looking for. Just a bunch of rocks, right? So it wasn't talking about that kind of Garden of the Gods. It was talking about something that would have looked up maybe and reminded you more of something that you would expect Eden to look like. But that's when he looked in that direction, that's kind of what he saw. And then you have this zinger that's kind of thrown in there. It says, and this is before those cities were destroyed. Just keep that in mind, reader. Okay, this is before those cities were destroyed. And it's kind of telegraphing this disaster that's going to come and that's going to take place. So Lot chooses by sight, and Abram yields and he trusts, while Lot grabs and he assumes. And the Hebrew in this is really strong, and it maybe doesn't come out in the strength in English that it's implied in the Greek, but it almost seems like innocent Lot just kind of says eeny, meeny, miny, mo, and kind of picks, okay, I'll go this way. No, the Hebrew implies that there's a lot more greed that's going along with that. That it's not just him making this random choice, but he's choosing something that's pretty selfish in the way that he goes about doing that. So it's kind of foreshadowing even more of his demise. And it not only tells us that he goes in that direction, but it says that he's pitching his tent near Sodom. So Lot moves towards Sodom. Soon he will be in Sodom, and then he will be ruined by Sodom, right? And we're going to see that by the time we get to chapter 19. So a couple of quick lessons in this. This is a lesson in choosing by sight rather than by promise, which Lot was guilty of. And not every green valley is something that's God's will. Just because it looks good doesn't mean it's the path that you're supposed to go, right? And some opportunities, may flourish your wallet but starve your soul. And this is kind of what winds up happening with Lot. And for a lot of us as guys, the wrong question is not, and it's the one that we often ask is this going to be profitable for me? Am I going to make something out of this? When maybe the better question is this something that's going to benefit the kingdom of God? Is this something that's God's will for me? Right? So those are maybe better questions to ask. Verse 14. Then the Lord said to Abram after Lot parted from him, and it's almost like Lord says, okay, now that he's gone, let's talk. Okay, but it says, Lord said to Abram after Lot had parted from him, look around you from where you are to the north and to the south and to the east and to the west. Okay, so when Lot was faced with the decision, what did he do? You remember what he did? With his eyes? He lifted up his eyes and he looked around. Okay, he did that. Look at what God does. God says, Abram, lift up your eyes. Abram hadn't done that yet. Maybe he'd looked around, maybe he hadn't, we don't know. But there's something in the narrative that's kind of showing us a contrast between Lot and Abram. Lot lifted up his eyes. He was looking for what was in it for him. Abram hadn't, and the first thing God says to him is lift up your eyes, look around from where you are to the north and the south and east and the west. All the land that you see I will give to you and your offspring forever. I will make your offspring like the dust of the earth, so that if anyone could count the dust, then your offspring could be counted. So go walk the length and the breadth of the land, for I am giving it to you. So you see the contrast. Lot grasped, Abram waited, God rewarded. And God gives, by this grace, what he gives to Abram, and Lot kind of sees what he thought was going to be owed to him in this moment. So God gives Abram land. He says, everywhere you look, turn all the way around, do a 360, everywhere you look, as far as your eye can see, this is land that I'm giving to you. He promises him this offspring. This offspring is literally, it's uncountable. So it says it's going to be like the dust of the earth. And sometimes when we think about the dust of the earth, it's so fine, it has all these particles in it. Think of it like the sand in the desert, okay? So go count the sand particles in the desert is what God is saying. This is the kind of offspring that you're going to be blessed with over time. And then he says too that this is going to be permanent. This land and the offspring that are going to be yours, this is going to be something that I'm going to do in you forever. Okay, it's going to be permanent. It's going to be a lasting blessing that I am giving to you. Dr. Constable said this. He said, the promise is reaffirmed only after Abram's act of generosity. Faith is something that leads to revelation. You remember last week we said this. We said, it's hard to receive what God has for you when your hands are full. Abram emptied his hands once again. Okay, and he got moving in the direction that God told him to go. And blessing came even in spite of Abram's imperfections, even in spite of his failures, the blessing still came. And Abram, once again, when faced with the decision, shows up this time. And he empties his hands. And God just blows his mind as a result of that. So the moral of the story is just when you trust God with open hands, He gives you so much more than you could possibly get, than you could possibly receive if you had closed fists. Okay, if you're holding tightly to all the things that you think you have control over. Last verse here, and then we're going to shift to our tables. But so Abram went to live near the great trees of Mamre of Hebron, where he pitched his tents. And what did he do? He built an altar to the Lord. So Abram moved once again, and I love this, and I want to kind of close out with this. If you notice, there's kind of this slight difference, and it's slight, but it's there, where Lot went and pitched his tents near Sodom. It was kind of a temporary living situation that he has. But Abram went back to Hebron, and he dwelt in the land. Okay, he put down roots. He realized, this is where I was supposed to be all along. I'm staying here. This is a different kind of thing than them settling. This was him arriving at the destination, and he settled there. I think a part of the life God has called us to live is that we are not of this world. We are wanderers. We were meant for heaven. We were meant for Eden, y'all. But in this land, God still calls us to dwell in it. All right. One of my favorite Psalms, another one of my favorite Psalms is Psalm 37. And it says this: trust in the Lord and do good. Dwell in the land and befriend faithfulness. And then this is the one that you know in the middle of this Psalm. Delight yourself in the Lord, and what? He will give you the desires of your heart. Commit your way to the Lord, and He will bring it to pass. He will bring your righteousness to shine forth as the noonday sun, is what it says. But it begins with dwelling in the land that God has called you to. So this morning, for your question, when has been a time, or maybe that time's even now, where God has called you to something and you had to let go of that death grip that you had on whatever it was that you were holding on to in order to receive what God has called you to. So the question as I read it, where is or has God been asking you to trust Him or His promise instead of grasping for control? So have some conversation about that at your table and pray for each other.